It's been years since the lockdowns, yet we still have a huge wait for driving tests in Great Britain. It got a bit better earlier on in the year, but now it's worse. And many people across the country are complaining that they can't book a driving test because their test centre is fully booked. And if they want a chance of getting a test, they've got to try and book one at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, because that's when new tests become available for 24 weeks ahead. That's nearly half a year wait to get a driving test, and they best be quick booking them because those bookings fill up quick. So why do we have such a long wait for driving tests? Why hasn't it got better? And is there a solution? There are three main reasons why there is such a long wait for driving tests at the moment. The first reason is there's simply not enough tests. And that's because there is not enough examiners to keep up with demand for tests. The second reason is the backlog of people waiting to book a test following the lockdowns and restrictions. During that period, there was around about 1 to 1.4 million tests lost. And that backlog has not been caught up with yet. It's changed over time, and at the moment, it's actually getting worse, not better. And the third reason is people buying up tests to sell them on for a profit. That means when someone goes to book their test with the DVSA, there are less tests available, or sometimes no tests at their local test centre. They can get a test, most likely, if they go looking for one, but they're going to have to pay a reseller, sometimes up to £150 over the normal price of a test. Driving test resellers actually make the backlog worse because they hold on to tests hoping to find a buyer to make a profit. If they don't find a buyer, they cancel the test as late as they can while still being able to get a full refund from the DVSA. So that test now goes back on the system for people to book. But the trouble is, there's not much time between booking the test and the actual test date. And therefore, it's just too short notice for it to be useful for many people. Some people still book it. They go, oh, grab it whilst it's available, and then worry about trying to get a car for the test. Then they're calling around instructors and relatives trying to find someone to take them to test. Sometimes they succeed, other times they don't. And if they don't succeed and they don't find a car to go to test in, well, there's no point cancelling it now because it's too late and they're not going to get a refund. So they just don't turn up. And my local test centre have said that they've noticed an increase in people who are not turning up for test. This wastes a test that somebody could have used. According to the DVSA, the Driving and Vehicle Standards Agency, they are the people who set the test. One of the main reasons behind this long queue for driving tests is booking habits from the learner driver and test resellers. What they're saying is that test resellers are holding on to tests, meaning there are less tests to book on the system. And learner drivers are booking a practical test as soon as they have passed the theory test, regardless of whether they know that date is going to be suitable. They plan to change that date if they need to. This never used to happen. Learner drivers used to learn to drive and then they would book the test when they were close to test standard. But now they're panic buying because, well, there's such a long wait. They think, well, let's just get a test just in case that I might be ready by that date. At least I've got something, and if I get ready earlier, I can try and bring it forwards. But what that causes is no tests to be available because all the tests that would be available are being held by learner drivers who may not use that date, and by resellers who are trying to make a profit. If we were to stop this, the situation would be much better. But I don't think it would cure the problem. And that's because I think there's simply not enough tests to go round. Here's how I've come to that conclusion. I've been through 15 years of driving test data to try and figure out how many practical tests we need to keep up with demand. And I think we can use theory test passes to figure this out, because you have to pass the theory test before you can take the practical test. Last year, the DVSA did 1.65 practical driving tests per theory test pass. Is that enough? Well, it's certainly more practical tests than people passing the theory test, but many people need more than one practical test to pass. Let's look at the years leading up to the lockdowns, and we can see The DVSA were typically doing between 1.8 and 1.9 practical tests per theory test pass. And during that period, times were okay. The test waiting list, the queue for the test, wasn't too bad. It was growing, shrinking, sometimes a bit long, sometimes it was pretty good, but it never got out of hand. But it did start to get out of hand in 2016. At the beginning of that year, the DVSA were only doing 1.6 tests. And the queue for the driving test had got up to about 3 months long. And by the end of the year, they had recruited more examiners and got test centre managers to do tests to increase the number of tests, and they were doing 2.09 tests per theory test pass by the end of the year. And they had brought down the queue from nearly 3 months to just under 8 weeks. If the DVSA are doing between 1.8 to 1.9 practical driving tests for everyone who passes the theory test, things are okay, the queues are fine. But if they do much less than that, the queue is growing and it's continuing to grow. And if they do more than that, then the queue is shrinking. For the queue to shrink at a meaningful rate, the DVSA need to do approximately 2 tests for everybody who passes the theory test. If they did that, the queue would shrink and the backlog would eventually disappear. But to do that, they would need approximately 25% more examiners than they currently have, assuming the same mix of part-time and full-time staff. One of the problems is if the DVSA were to increase their examiners by that amount, well, that would clear the backlog, but what would they do with all those examiners once that backlog had cleared and there wasn't enough people wanting tests compared to how many examiners they have? Learner drivers need to pass the practical test within 2 years of passing the theory test, because the theory test is only valid for 2 years. If they don't, they need to do the theory test again. This actually makes theory test passes a better indicator of how many practical tests are needed, because it's a fairly up-to-date figure of how many people are likely looking to book the practical test. Here are some figures because you may just find them interesting. Last year, approximately 48% of people passed first time. 52% of people needed more than 1 attempt. And out of everyone who turned up for a driving test last year, 845,000 of them were on their first attempt. That doesn't mean they passed first time, that just means they were taking their first attempt. That's how many first attempts there were. There were 492,000 second attempts, some passed, some didn't. 258,000 third attempts, 134,000 fourth attempts, 70,000 fifth attempts, and 93,000 were on their 6th or greater attempt. The pass rate for the practical test has actually been very stable for many years. Of course, if that was to change, that would change how many practical tests are needed compared to how many theory tests are passed. But as it's such a stable figure, it makes predicting how many practical tests are needed compared to theory test passes actually rather easy. Now I'm going to talk about possible solutions to clear this backlog and reduce the waiting time for driving tests. The first one is the obvious one: increase the number of examiners, but there are 3 main problems in doing this. One, I've already touched on. If you increase the number of examiners to clear the backlog, what do you do with all those examiners once the backlog has cleared? Well, you could say, well, the DVSA could go to a recruitment agency and get short-term staff. But driving examiners have a very specialist role. Their job requires a lot of training. Recruitment agencies do not have driving examiners on standby ready to go and help the DVSA clear a backlog. The second problem is, well, I've already kind of mentioned it in the first problem, it takes a long time to train examiners. It's a specialist job, and the people doing the training also have a very specialist job. So there's only so many examiners, new examiners, that the DVSA can recruit in 1 year. And the third problem, well, there's only so many people who are willing to be a driving examiner or who want to stay a driving examiner. Now you could say, and I hear this one a lot, examiners need a pay rise. That way the job is more attractive, they're more likely to stay in the job, and we're going to get more examiners that way. But the DVSA are not a typical private corporation who can pay their staff based on supply and demand. All right, we need more of this staff. Well, we'll offer more money and we'll get more in the door. No, they're an executive agency of the government. Their employees are civil servants on a civil servant pay scale. If the DVSA was to give driving examiners a significant pay rise, all the other civil servants and all the other different agencies are also going to want a pay rise. So the DVSA are fairly restricted in how many new examiners they can recruit. But is there anything else they can do? Is there anything else they are doing? Well, yes, actually. They're trying to increase the pass rate because they know if they increase the pass rate, less practical tests will be needed. And that will solve the problem. And how they're going about this is by putting the onus on driving instructors. They're saying to us, if your pass rate is above this, we will leave you alone. But if your pass rate is below this level, we're going to check up on you. And generally, driving instructors don't like the DVSA checking up on them because they find it nerve-wracking. So there's a big incentive there for driving instructors to bring up the pass rate. So is it working? Well, no. And neither is the Ready to Pass campaign. That campaign is directed at the learner driver to encourage the learner driver to only go to test when they are ready. And the reason why I know it's not working is because the driving test pass rate is about where it normally is. It's on the high side of normal, which is good, but it's still in the normal range. The fact is, driving instructors don't have a great deal of control of who goes to test. A driving instructor may say, I'm only taking people to test who are very likely to pass. But if they have a learner who's not likely to pass, and that learner really wants to go to test, often they find a way. Because they can use somebody else's car, or they could even use their own car. So if the pass rate of driving instructors across the country was to go up, that doesn't necessarily mean the pass rate for the country would go up because not everybody uses their driving instructor to go to test, but many people do. And many people listen to their driving instructor and only go to test when their driving instructor says that they are ready. So if the pass rate of driving instructors go up, there should be at least some kind of effect on the overall pass rate in the country. It should go up at least a bit, but it hasn't. That suggests to me that despite the pressure from the DVSA to increase the pass rate of driving instructors, the pass rate of driving instructors hasn't gone up either. I actually think the DVSA are doing most of what they can do to solve this problem. However, I think they are stuck in the mud. What I mean by that is they are doing what they can, but they're too restricted to move. They can't do enough. However, there is one thing they're failing at, and that is preventing people from selling on tests, especially for a profit. Now, this isn't my idea. This is an idea from another instructor, but what they could do to solve this problem is prevent the ability of changing names on tests. If you cannot swap a name on a test, you cannot swap tests between people, and therefore you can't sell the test on. That's how the system works. You can have a test booked and then change the name on that test. This isn't likely going to be popular amongst many instructors though, because many instructors use this system to do just that. So they have a test available for when someone is ready and they can swap that test between pupils. But also some driving schools operate with this as a benefit to them. They can say, look, come to us, we will teach you to drive quickly and we have some early driving test dates ready for you. An intensive course, for example, might sell themselves that way. Or some instructors just like to sell them on for a profit. But if the DVSA wanted to, they could stop this from happening. However, even if the DVSA did succeed at this and prevented people from selling on tests for a profit, or even prevented driving instructors from swapping tests around pupils so they've always got one available, this wouldn't actually solve the problem with the backlog, but it would make it better. Some people believe that how long the theory test is valid for should be extended beyond 2 years, as there's such a wait for the practical test. But I can't see the DVSA agreeing to this because it would be seen as lowering the driving test standard, as people who are passing the driving test would have less up-to-date knowledge about the theory. Also, it won't actually have an impact on the backlog for the practical test. One solution would be to lower the driving test standard. This would increase the pass rate and on average mean that less attempts are needed for people to pass the driving test. This would clear the backlog, but the government are trying to reduce road deaths, not increase road deaths. And people already using the road are unlikely going to be happy about the driving test standard being lowered, and driving standards in the country maybe being lowered as a result. So I think this is very unlikely to happen. Some driving instructors think a solution to the problem would be to only allow driving instructors to book driving tests. Learner drivers could not book their own driving tests, and to only allow dual controlled vehicles to go to test, so learners couldn't use their own vehicles. In theory, this could reduce the backlog because driving instructors are under pressure to increase their pass rate. And if driving instructors have more control of who goes to test, in theory, they could raise the pass rate of the country. As a result, less tests would be needed and that would reduce the backlog. But before you decide this is a good idea, you need to consider that more control is being given to the driving instructor in exchange for less control for the rest of the general public. And only you can decide whether or not that's a good idea. I can give you my opinion. My opinion is we already have too many restrictions and we should have more freedoms. And even though I am a driving instructor and I would benefit from this restriction because I would actually have more control, as the rest of the general public would have less control, it's not something I would support. And also, it's not guaranteed to solve anything because that assumes that driving instructors would actually increase their own pass rate. Another suggestion I hear from driving instructors, and to be fair, this suggestion has been made for a long time now, long before we had this long wait for driving tests. So it's not just about trying to fix the backlog. And that is to have a minimum number of hours that someone must have with a driving instructor before they can do the practical test. Now, the advantage is that may raise the pass rate of the practical test, and therefore that would help the backlog. It will help reduce that wait time for a test. But the disadvantage is it penalises people who don't need that minimum number of hours. And some people don't use a driving instructor at all when they pass their driving test. That is still a freedom we have in this country. I would like to actually know whether or not it does work and it does increase the pass rate. I'd like to find that out because I have a hunch that it wouldn't, but I like to know whether or not I'm right or wrong about things. But only you can make a decision as to whether or not you think it's a good idea. Some people suggest that driving instructors should be doing driving tests so that there's more tests available. But there are many problems with this. The first problem is corruption. At the moment, we either teach people to drive, we are a driving instructor, or we test whether or not someone should have a driving license. That means we would be a driving examiner. We can either do one or the other. We can't do both because of corruption. And driving instructors are trained very differently to driving examiners. So if a driving instructor wanted to do tests, they'll still have to go through the whole training process to become an examiner. And driving instructors generally earn a higher hourly rate than driving examiners, so driving instructors are unlikely going to exchange their driving lessons for driving tests. So why then, if driving instructors generally have a higher hourly rate than examiners, why do so many instructors quit their instructor job to go through all the training to become an examiner? Well, just because instructors generally have a higher hourly rate, it doesn't mean they're better off. Examiners have a consistent level of pay. Instructors have to make sure they keep themselves busy. Examiners get holiday pay, sick pay, what's deemed as a generous pension, although I don't know much about pensions. They don't have to pay for the upkeep of their car after all their pupils have been driving it, and they don't get last-minute cancellations, meaning they lose money that day. So although driving instructors generally have a higher hourly rate, it's not necessarily the case that they earn more money than examiners. So there are solutions to this problem, but they seem to come with their own problems. So I think we're going to have this long wait for driving tests for some time yet. I think things are getting worse at the moment, not better. That seems to be the case. And Therefore, the DVSA do really need to increase examiner numbers, which is what they're trying to do, but there's only so many they can add in a set period of time. What they could do is make alterations to the OBS system, the system that driving instructors use to book driving tests for pupils, or even shut down the system for Category B driving tests. I'm going to be unpopular for suggesting that, but if they were to shut it down and they were to allow anyone that had a test under their name for that test to be with them, and then that member of the public can make alterations to that test as they wish, they could cancel it or change it, but the control is taken away from the driving instructor, I think that would free up quite a few tests onto the system for the general public to book. I could be wrong, and I'm sure it's not going to solve the problem, but I think it would help, and it would give the public more control to find and book their own driving tests without being ripped off by a reseller. Well, I hope if you're a driving instructor and you're watching this, you're not too angry with me for suggesting that. If you found the video interesting, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, then Collingwood are there for you, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy, and that takes away a big stress from the owner of that car that you're using to practice your driving in. Via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 gift card. If you want to insure your own car, I recommend checking out the link to confused.com, because you fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest, and you can change your car on that quote as many times as you like without having to do the whole quote again. So it's a quick and easy way to compare how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.